Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today for our Nebraska and Missouri Bumblebee Atlas Protocols training. We are so excited that you've chosen to spend your afternoon with us. And I think we can start off with just a few introductions from the Atlas coordination team. I can start. My name is Genevieve Podesic. I am one of the coordinators of the Bumblebee Atlas with the Xerces Society. I am based in St. Paul, Minnesota, but I work in Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and Nebraska. And I'll pass it to Katie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Lampe. I'm a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society as well, and I'm based in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'll pass it to Debbie.
Hi, my name is Debbie Finke. I'm an entomologist at the University of Missouri, and my students and I help support the Atlas.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Morphew. I am the pollinator ecologist for the Missouri Department of Conservation, and I also help support the Atlas. Stephanie, I think it's you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Paris. I'm the pollinator biologist for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, and I'm based out of Lincoln, Nebraska.
Thank you, everyone, for those super lovely introductions. I think we can go ahead and get started with the presentation. Before we kick things off, I just want to give a shout out to all of the Xerces members who are in the audience. The Bumblebee Atlas is a program that is run in partnership with the Xerces Society. Both Katie and I work for Xerces. Xerces is a science-based nonprofit organization which was founded more than 40 years ago and is named for the now extinct Xerces blue butterfly. Broadly, we are focused on invertebrate conservation, and that includes work with bumblebees. So I just want to give a thank you to all of our members out there. It's because of your support that we are able to engage with programs like the Atlas. I'll also mention that this is part two of a two-part training series. Part one covered bumblebee ecology and conservation, giving you all the foundation of knowledge you need to participate in the Atlas, to understand the organisms that we are interested in and why we are interested in monitoring them. Part two is going to cover Bumblebee Atlas protocols, but if you missed part one, I would check it out. The recording is available on the Xerces YouTube channel, and we'll be posting it to the online trading portal soon. Just an overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll start off with an overview of the program and our study design, and then we'll talk about how you can sign up for the Atlas and how to conduct a survey on your own for bumblebees. After that, we'll talk about how you can submit your data to Bumblebee Watch, and we'll wrap things up by talking about how to identify and photograph bumblebees. So, big picture project overview. The Bumblebee Atlas is a community science program focused on tracking and monitoring bumblebees. This is a collaborative effort. We have lots of different partners helping us out run these programs. So the states that are shown in the dark teal on this map are states that have active Bumblebee Atlas programs that are run in partnership with the Xerces Society. So, we're in about half the country, which is really amazing. The Bumblebee Atlas is focused on one group of pollinators, which are bumblebees, and there are lots of different reasons to target this group. The first one is that bumblebees are imperiled. About a quarter of the bumblebee species in North America are considered to be threatened or endangered or at risk. And so, from a conservation perspective, this is a really important group of insects. Bumblebees are also really excellent pollinators. They're habitat generalists. They forage on lots of different types of plants, and they're found in lots of different types of habitats. And they also have a really unique ecological niche. They are able to fly when it's a little bit chilly outside, which is pretty unique for bees. So they're able to pollinate when it's cool and sometimes when it's even a little bit drizzly outside, which is really important for many of our spring blooming wildflowers, our spring ephemerals, as well as our flowering trees. Bumblebees are also a really great target for community science programs. They're charismatic, they are easy to recognize, they're big, they're fluffy, they're super cute. People just really love them. And people have loved bumblebees for a long time. We actually have pretty decent historical data on bumblebees, at least compared to other groups of bees. And because of this, we are actually able to do research to assess their status. The Bumblebee Atlas, like all community science programs, relies on the time and effort of community scientists. Our participants go out and conduct formal surveys for bumblebees and help us establish baseline data sets for these animals. And using this data, we can do things like monitor population changes, monitor the distributions of species, and fill in knowledge gaps related to habitat associations and floral preferences. We can then use this information to begin forming evidence-based recommendations to restore high-quality habitat for these animals. When we initiate a Bumblebee Atlas program in a state or a region, our goal is to conduct a inventory of all of the bumblebees. So spreading out across the region, doing surveys to conduct a broad census for bumblebees. So to do this, we split up each state into these really big 50 by 50 kilometer grid cells and encourage participants to go out to grids and do surveys. So we survey across the region. So we're gathering information on bumblebee distributions and habitat and foraging associations, and then applying what we've learned to on-the-ground conservation. In several states or regions in the US, we've been running Bumblebee Atlas projects for quite a long time. We've actually done a really good job conducting that inventory work. And so in several states this year, we are moving to a new phase of the Atlas program focused on long-term monitoring. And that suite of states includes Missouri and Nebraska. So with long-term monitoring, we'll be narrowing our survey efforts and our focus from the entire state to select long-term monitoring stations, which you can see there in the orange. So our goal with this effort is to learn more about species detectability and occupancy, with a focus on our at-risk species that we're still encountering in the state. So in Missouri and Nebraska, that would be species like the American bumblebee, the black and gold bumblebee, the half-black bumblebee, Southern Plains bumblebee, and Morrison's bumblebee. So we want to focus on these at-risk species. We also want to make sure that we're aligning our priorities with other efforts to monitor bumblebees that are being run by the U.S. Geological Survey and the U.S. National Native Bee Monitoring Research Coordination Network. So we want to help them in their efforts to monitor bumblebees. And so to do that, we are actually going to be adopting a new grid map. So instead of using those 50 by 50 kilometer grids, we are going to be using the 10 by 10 kilometer grid map that was established by the North American Bat Monitoring Network. So this is a 10 by 10 grid that spans the entire continent of North America. It's a really commonly used grid for wildlife research. And we're going to be selecting a subset of those grids as our long-term monitoring stations in each state. So we're going to pick 15 to 20 grids where we're going to be focusing our survey efforts for long-term monitoring. So as I mentioned, our goal here is to better understand patterns of occupancy for bumblebees, so whether or not a species is at a site. Now you might be wondering to yourself, aren't we already measuring occupancy? When we're going and we're surveying, we're recording whether or not species were detected. And I really want to emphasize here that presence-absence data, like we've been collecting, is really important for calculating occupancy, but it's not quite the same thing as occupancy. Because if you go to a site and look for bumblebees, you can look, but that doesn't necessarily mean you are going to detect all of the species that are there. Bumblebees have what we call imperfect detection. So things like the availability of flowers, what types of flowers are blooming, the temperatures, the weather conditions, what time of year you're going out, those things all influence whether or not you're going to detect a species. And because of that, we need to account for that imperfect detection when we are assessing occupancy. For occupancy modeling, it is really, really important to have multiple visits to the same location. So during each one of your visits or your surveys, you're going to be documenting all of those species that you encounter. And from that data, we can build what's called an encounter history at each site. So this encounter history helps us understand how likely it is we'll find a species given that it's there, also known as detection probability. And if you take where you found species across its range and where you've looked for them, and account for how likely it is you are going to detect them given that they're there, you can calculate occupancy, which is what we're trying to get at. So for the most part, for this long-term monitoring effort, we will be keeping our survey methods pretty much the same. We'll be going out for 45 minutes, searching hectare-sized areas for bumblebees. The main thing that's going to be changing is the location and the frequency of visits. So we want to visit our long-term monitoring stations multiple times during the peak of the bumblebee season in July and August. Ideally, folks who are going to be adopting long-term monitoring stations will be visiting the same hectare size site 4 times during that peak survey window. Now, I'll mention visiting the same site 4 different times is a lot of work, and it's not going to be feasible for everybody. At the end of the day, the Bumblebee Atlas relies on the efforts of volunteers. So even if you can only do 1 survey or 2 surveys, we still encourage you to adopt a long-term monitoring station if you can make it out there to do surveys during that survey window. I'll also mention phase 2, it might not be for you. A lot of our participants are very place-based. They may not be able to travel, or they are really invested in surveying the same site that they've been at before, and that site may not fall within a long-term monitoring station. And that's okay. It's not required to participate in long-term monitoring to participate in the Atlas. It's okay if you want to survey elsewhere. It's okay if you want to survey in June and September. And I'll also mention that June and September, those tail ends of the field season, are really great times to look for bumblebees in new locations. So you can still survey during those tail ends of the season at places that aren't long-term monitoring sites. You can survey places that don't fall within those long-term monitoring sites as well. No matter where you're surveying, the data that you collect is so valuable and helps us better understand these species. So long-term monitoring or not, you are still participating in the Atlas and you are still supporting conservation of bumblebees in this region. Next, we will talk about how to sign up. So because we are using that new North American bat monitoring grid map, if you're going to be participating in the Atlas this year, you will need to sign up for a new grid cell. You will need to go to our Adopt a Grid Cell page and fill out the form there in order to sign up for the program and let us know where you'll be surveying. And so to help you, to give you a little bit of guidance on how to do that, I'm actually going to be exiting out of my share window and showing you live what it looks like to adopt a grid cell. Just give me a minute. All right, I hope you guys can all see my share screen. So this is the grid adoption page. At the very beginning, there are some things that you need, some steps you need to take to get started. Step 1 is where you'll be able to fill out the grid adoption form. So if we explore the grid adoption form, we've actually updated our form so that the map and the survey form are connected. So on the left side, we have our map, and then on the right side, we have our form. So there's a splash screen letting you know we've updated the form, so you can just click out of that and then fill in the state where you want to adopt a grid cell. And that will zoom you in to the grid map for that state. So here we have the grid map for Nebraska. We can see that some grids are highlighted in that light teal color and some are completely transparent. So those teal grids are our long-term monitoring stations, which are our priority areas for 2026. And the other grids are our non-priority grids. So you can adopt either one using this form. If you'd like to adopt a grid, you can click on the grid, and that will bring up a window that says you've selected this grid, and that actually automatically fills out the form for you with the grid that you've selected, and then all you need to do is fill out the rest of the form with your name and your information, and then hit submit to adopt your grid, and then you'll get a confirmation email from us confirming that you've adopted that grid cell. Now, if you want to submit or if you want to adopt a grid that's not a long-term monitoring station, you can click on one of the grids that's not highlighted in teal. This has updated the information in the grid adoption form with this new grid. And so I can adopt that grid cell if I choose to. You can adopt the grids that are on the map, wherever you are. You can also use the grid adoption map to explore your grid site. So if you zoom in, you'll be able to check out the landscape that your grid cell falls within. You can also use the search tool to search for particular places or locations. So, if you know that you want to survey at a particular public site, you can type in the name of that park and hit search, and that will bring you to that location, and you can zoom out to see what grid cell it's in. So really nifty tool, super useful for exploring grids. And then this is what you're going to want to do once you're ready to sign up for the program. You're first going to want to adopt one of these grids or multiple grids if you choose. There's no limitation on how many grids you adopt. As long as you can go out and do surveys there, you're welcome to adopt more than one grid if you'd like. Right, and I'll just hop back on to my presentation. Right, next we'll talk about how you can conduct a survey. For this next section, I'm going to be providing an overview of our survey methods for long-term monitoring. And as I mentioned, not a lot is going to be changing. We're going to be pretty much using the same point survey protocols as we have in past years. But there are a few small adjustments that we are going to be making that I want to walk you through. The first of which is that for occupancy modeling, it's really important to document all of the different species that you encounter. So while you're going out and doing your bumblebee surveys, you want to focus on making sure you're documenting all the species. So if you're searching for bees and you see a bee that looks really different and you see a bee that looks very similar to the bees you've already caught, I would focus on the bee that looks different, like prioritizing getting all of the species. We are also going to be collecting a little bit more detailed data on the floral resource availability and the presence of honeybees at your survey site. And we'll walk through these changes in a little bit more detail when we talk about the survey protocols. So when you survey is really up to you. For long-term monitoring, our survey window is going to be July 1st through the end of August. If you're doing 4 surveys within that survey window at your long-term monitoring station, it's best if you space them out every few weeks or so. So doing a couple surveys in July, a couple surveys in August. But that might not always be feasible. A few of these long-term monitoring stations are pretty remote. So if you need to, you can complete up to 2 surveys at that same hectare size site in a single day. So you can do 2 surveys one day in July, and then the following day do 2 more surveys, and that will meet the requirements to complete 4 surveys at that long-term monitoring station. You want to go out when conditions are optimal for bumblebees, so when temperatures are between 60 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, when wind speeds are below 15 miles per hour, and when it's not actively raining outside. Where you survey is also up to you. Each long-term monitoring station contains at least some public land, and you can survey anywhere in your long-term monitoring station where you have the appropriate permissions and permits. I personally think that locating a place to do surveys is one of the biggest hurdles of participating in the Atlas. So for those of you who are participating in long-term monitoring, we're actually going to put together a document this year with some recommendations on where to go to survey. So as I mentioned, each one of these grids contains at least some public land, We will have an outline of those public lands and how you would obtain permits and permissions in this document. And hopefully we'll get it ready by June 1st. So if you do adopt a long-term monitoring station, we'll be sending that out to those of you. We'll be sending out this document to those of you who have adopted that, so you will be able to reference it when you're choosing a survey site. So you may survey on, public lands or private lands as long as you have the appropriate permits and permissions. Public land in both Missouri and Nebraska can be managed or owned by governmental organizations like the state or the federal government, or a nonprofit like the Nature Conservancy. And oftentimes they will need you to apply for a specific permit or ask for permission to survey there. You're also welcome to survey on public land as long as you have the permission. So that could be land you own or land owned by a friend or a family member. If you do plan to survey on your own property or on, another person's property, please keep in mind that that survey location should be at least a hectare in size. A really nice, lovely garden like the one you see here can be a great spot to look for bumblebees, but if it's not a hectare, then it's not a good site for surveys. And if you do survey private land that's not your own, make sure that you obtain written permission to survey on that land, and that you carry that with you when you're doing your survey. Just some things to keep in mind while you're surveying. You want to make sure that you respect private property and that you have permission from the landowner when you're conducting survey activities. Unless you have explicit permission from a private landowner, please make sure that you're staying on public lands and right-of-ways during your survey. Please note that grids, both long-term monitoring grids and non-priority grids, can include both public and private land. And as a Xerces volunteer, you must not trespass on private land. So when you're at a site, please make sure you're looking carefully for markers of private land. And if you do happen to find yourself on private property and you don't have permission or you've been asked to leave, please leave even if your survey is not complete. And for your own protection from trespass claims, you want to make sure that your permissions are written. And then for public lands, you want to make sure that you have land manager permission or that you have the appropriate permits for things like county or city or local parks. I mentioned that you do need permits for public lands in general, and the Atlas program actually holds several umbrella permits for our participants in each of the states that we work in. In Nebraska, we hold a permit for Nebraska Game and Parks properties, so that includes state parks and wildlife management areas and state recreation areas. You do need to be named specifically on this permit if you would like to survey Nebraska Game and Parks properties. So please contact us at any Bumblebee Atlas at xerces.org so that we can add you to this permit beforehand. And I will mention that many of our long-term monitoring stations overlap with Nebraska Game and Parks properties. So if you're thinking that you want to participate in long-term monitoring, you likely will want to be on this permit. For Missouri state lands, for Missouri Department of Conservation lands, no permit is required, but you will need to sign a volunteer agreement and send that to the appropriate manager before you do your survey. So MDC properties include places like nature centers, and they manage lots of different prairies. Missouri state parks are actually owned and managed by the Missouri DNR. So for those properties, you will need a permit in order to survey there. Please let us know if you're interested in surveying a state park, and we can get you in contact with the Missouri DNR to apply for a permit. We are also working with other organizations to obtain permits. So the most recent and up-to-date information on permits is going to be found on the Bumblebee Atlas website on our permits page. So keep an eye out for that. Just some other places you may be interested in surveying. Missouri Prairie Foundation properties are really great, beautiful prairies. No permits are going to be required to do Bumblebee Atlas surveys at those locations, but I would give the Missouri Prairie Foundation a heads up if you do plan to survey there, just to let them know that you'll be on the property. In general, city and county parks are going to require permits or permissions, so you will want to contact the area manager to see if permits are required. Now, we'll also mention that properties that are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Park Service will always require a permit, and we currently do not hold umbrella permits for any properties managed by either of those organizations. So please do not survey these lands unless you have specifically obtained a permit from one of these services. All right, so once you've found a suitable survey location, it's time to go out and do a survey. And each survey has two components. A bumblebee survey, where you go out and you document the bumblebees you're observing, and an assessment of habitat, so that we can connect what's going on with the bumblebees with what's going on in the landscape where you're surveying. So to do a survey, you are going to be searching a hectare-sized area for bumblebees for a period of 45 person minutes. So this hectare-sized area, it can be any shape. It could be really long and skinny. It can be sort of a weird oblong shape, or it could be a rectangle, as long as it's a hectare. A hectare, just to give you an idea of what that looks like, is the size of about 2 football fields. And so if you're out there in the field, you can just kind of eyeball it. What does 2 football fields approximately look like? And what we mean by 45 person minutes is that if you're going out by yourself, you're going to spend 45 minutes collecting bees. But if you're going out with a friend, you can split that time up. It's person minutes, so if you have 2 people, you can each do 22.5 minutes of searching and add that up to 45. And if you're going out with 3 people, then you can split it up into 15 minutes each, and each search for bumblebees for 15 minutes. That will add up to 45. We highly recommend going out with a friend if possible. It's always safer to do field work with another person. But if you aren't going out with a friend, please make sure that you let somebody know what your survey plan is before you go out, when and where you'll be, and then when you'll be back, so that they know to keep an eye out for you, and that you're going to be doing field work at that time. So when you are doing a survey, when you're searching that hectare-sized area for bumblebees, you are going to be using non-lethal methods to document bumblebees. So you're going to be catching all the bees you see, putting them on ice to immobilize them, and taking pictures of them to photo document them, and then releasing them at the end of your survey. So you're going to walk really slowly through your survey area, collecting all the bumblebees that you spot. You want to prioritize making sure you document all of the species that you could possibly encounter during your survey. And you want to only count the time that you're spent actively searching for bumblebees. So you want to pause your timer as you're keeping track of your time whenever you are doing something that's not searching or netting for bees. So when you're collecting bees and moving them from the net to a vial so you can put it in your cooler, you don't want to count that time. You don't want to count time taking notes, just the time you're spending searching and netting. Optionally, if you're able to recognize our target species, so that would be Southern Plains, American, yellow, half black, black and gold, and Morrison's bumblebees, the first time you encounter those species, you can record the time of day at which you first sight them, and that will just help us keep track of how long it takes one of our volunteers to sight those bees when they're at a site. But that's optional. You don't have to do it if you're not familiar with those species. It's totally okay not to do that. So it can be really hard to learn how to do some of these field skills from an online training video. So to help you guys out, I'm going to be showing you 2 short videos showing you how you can net a bumblebee and how you can move a bumblebee from a net to a vial, just to give you an idea of what that looks like for somebody who's in the field. I'm just going to go ahead and stop my screen share. All right.
When you're out collecting your bumblebees, you want to make sure you're doing it carefully, but you also want to make sure you're doing it with a technique where you're actually going to be successful in capturing the bumblebee. Now, the best way to do it is to come from the side. You'll actually sweep over the tops of the flowers, but the most important part is to make sure you follow through and have the net droop over the side of the rim, and you can actually flip it over a third time so the bee can't escape. And another way, you can come from below the bee if the flower is kind of drooping, and you can come up. But again, you have to have that follow through where you flip the net over the top. Another way, if you're feeling a little more timid about sweeping really hard, is bees tend to fly up when they try to escape. So you can actually put the net over the top of the flowers that it's on, and the bee will usually fly up to the top of the net, or once it gets about halfway, you can just tip the net over, and then it'll be captured in the bottom of your net.
All right. Next, I'll be showing you a really short video on how to move a bumblebee from a net to a vial. Put that over here.
So once you've collected your bee, you're going to gather the net up so that the bee is restricted to one part of the net. And then you're going to take your vial with the lid off, slide it up the net to that area where you've kind of narrowed or bottlenecked the net. You'll slide the bee into the vial and keep that net nice and tight over the top of the vial. Once he's in there, you can take your lid, you can slide it up the net to get to where the top of the vial is. And then you can sometimes keep the net inside the opening and then slide the net out once your lid's on top. Or you can just, if he's cooperating or she's cooperating, you can just slide the lid right over the top, and then you've got your bumblebee. Once you've collected it, you can put it in your cooler or put it on ice, or so you can prepare to process that bee once you're done with your survey.
All right. And I will mention that these videos were created a while ago for another Atlas program, but they're still really applicable to what we're doing in the Midwest. So you might have noticed the landscape looked a little bit different. That video was actually created by folks in Idaho, but it's a really great resource. I think it really helps to see the action of moving those bees from the nets to the vials and how to catch them. Right, and I think my slide deck is still shared, so moving on to the next step. So after you have completed your Atlas survey, once your bees are cold, you can photo document them. And when you are recording your bumblebee observations and photo documenting your bees, it's really important to keep track of which bees go with which photos and also which bees you observed on which host plants. So when you're going out and surveying for bumblebees, you want to make sure that you're documenting what host plant that you're seeing them on. And there are lots of ways to do this. You can, put a little piece of the flower into your vial, or you can label it with a Sharpie. I like to take a piece of tape and write down the flower that I saw my bee on, and then take that tape and stick it to the vial and then put that in the cooler. So it's really up to you, but you want to make sure that you're keeping track of what bees you're taking pictures of and then what host plants you saw them on. So when you take your bees out of the vials, you're going to put them on to your data sheet. We have a special grid just for taking pictures, and you're going to take your pictures. You want to make sure that you're recording what photo numbers go with that bee. And there are lots of ways to do this. So you can include a post-it or a label of some kind in your photo itself, or you can record the numbers of the photos that are recorded in your camera, or you can write down the time when you took the photo. When I am taking pictures with my cell phone camera, I like to write down the time because that's included in the metadata of those photos. So whatever works for you is great. You just want to make sure you're keeping track of the bumblebee species, what host plant it's on, and then the numbers of the photos that go with that bee. All right, so the next part of your Bumblebee Atlas survey is that rapid habitat assessment. This is not meant to be exhaustive by any means. It should be relatively short, should take you about 15 to 30 minutes, depending on your level of experience and the complexity of the area that you're surveying. You will want to document what types of, or what kind of habitat that you're in. Are you in a grassland? Are you in a forest? Are you in an ag field? What type of habitat surrounds your survey area, that hectare-sized survey area where you did your survey. You want to document how many plant species you saw and how much of the area is in bloom, and then what management is occurring. And we'll talk in more detail about some of these questions when we talk about submitting your data. There are two new components that I do want to go over in more detail that are new for long-term monitoring this year. The first of which is a honeybee assessment. So this year we asked, when you're doing your rapid habitat assessment, to set aside 10 minutes to walk through your site and count up the number of honeybees you spot. We're also going to ask you this year to take a little bit more detailed information on floral resource availability. So I'll walk you through how to do this. Here we have an example on the left-hand side of a plant community in a square hectare-sized field site. So the first step of documenting the abundance of flowers is to walk through the site and count the number of different species of blooming plants you're seeing. Next, you'll estimate what percentage of that hectare-sized plot had flowering resources where you could search for bumblebees. So in a really nice prairie in July and August, you might be able to walk through and find flowers at 100% of that area. In some lower quality sites, there may only be flowering plants in 10% of the site. It just is going to depend on the quality of the site that you're looking in. So those first two steps should feel really familiar to returning participants. That's data that we collected during phase 1 of the Atlas. What's going to be new is that we are going to be estimating the proportion of the bloom that each species contributes. So, species 1, did it make up 40% of that in-bloom area? Or did it make up 20%? Basically, you're just going to roughly estimate what proportion of that bloom is made up by each species. Do the best you can. It doesn't have to be perfect. You're going to eyeball it, and some of the numbers are not going to be super accurate. You're just going to try to give us an idea of how much of each type of flower there is in your hectare-sized site. So this is what your data sheet will look like after you've filled it out. So we have the list of the different plant species in bloom, as well as the percent of the bloom that they make up. And these numbers should add up to 100% because, no matter if you're surveying an area that has floral resources in half of the hectare or a tenth of the hectare, the numbers here are referring to the total bloom area, not to the total site. Before your survey, you are going to need to gather some required equipment. You will need copies of our data sheets and a writing utensil so that you can fill out the information that we need appropriately. You will also need a net so that you can catch the bumblebees. We recommend the nets that are available from Home Science Tools or forestry suppliers. Home Science Tools in particular has a really great net for about $15 that you can purchase. The main thing to keep an eye out for is whether or not you can see through the mesh of your net. Some insect nets are not transparent, you can't see through them, and when you're trying to manipulate a bee into a vial, it's really important to have a net you can see through. So you're going to want to make sure that you have a mesh net that you can look through. You're also going to need something to hold the bees in. We recommend using plastic vials, either 30 or 50 milliliters in size. But you can use other household items if you'd prefer. You can use old pill bottles or little tiny jam jars. It just depends on your preference. I recommend using something plastic that you can close. Glass isn't always the best option in the field. You will need a cooler with ice that you can chill the bees in. Please make sure to use regular ice and not blue ice or dry ice because the blue ice and dry ice might be too cold for the bees. You will need a camera so you can take pictures of the bumblebees you catch. A smartphone is totally fine for this, but it is really nice to have a camera with a macro lens. So if you have a camera with a macro lens, that is preferable. You will need a timer and a way to collect weather info. That can be your phone. And it's really nice, but not necessary, to have ID guides and a copy of the handbook with you when you're in the field. It's nice to have something to reference when you're trying to identify the bees you're collecting to species. And the handbook is nice to have so that you can reference it in case you forget something about the survey protocols, but those two last things are not required. I mentioned that it can be really hard to get comfortable with field methods from watching an online training. So we are going to be pairing this event, this online event, with in-person field days. We'll be hopefully holding 3 field days in each state that we're working in this year. We have our field days for Nebraska planned out. We'll be in Denton, Ponca, and St. Paul. I'll also be holding an event in Pacific Junction, Iowa, which is really close to Omaha. And then in Missouri, we'll be in Blue Springs. Blue Springs is really close to Kansas City. And we're also working on organizing 2 more events in Missouri. So we love hanging out with you guys in the field. You are all more than welcome to attend. If you're interested in signing up, you can go to our events page and sign up for our in-person trainings. We would love to see you there. So please check it out and sign up if you're interested in joining. All right, for the next section of the talk, I will be walking you all through how to submit your data to our online data submission platform, bumblebeewatch.org. Bumblebeewatch.org is a site that's a little bit like iNaturalist or eBird, if you've ever used one of those sites. It's a place where you can submit photo observations of animals and where you can submit your survey information as well. So, this site was launched in 2014. We've gotten tons and tons of observations into it so far, and it's the place where you'll submit your atlas data if you're participating in the atlas. Just a few reminders regarding best practices for data submission. You want to make sure that you enter your data as soon as you can after you've completed your survey. If you wait a long time, it's easy to lose your data sheets. It's easy to forget stuff. It's best to do it as soon as you can. You want to make sure that you keep a good record of which photos go with which bee and that you organize your photos on your computer before you go to Bumblebee Watch to upload them to the website. I like to have a folder on my desktop with all of my photos organized into folders so that I have selected the photos I want to submit for each bee and that they're all curated and organized and ready to go before I go to submit my data. You want to make sure that you are including the best photos that you took. Sometimes you might take some photos that are really blurry and really bad. You can submit up to 5 photos with your Bumblebee Watch submission. So choosing the photos that look the best and making sure you have lots of different angles will be really helpful for you once you go to submit your data online. And with that, I will stop my screen share and I will go to the Bumblebee Watch website and walk you all through how to submit data to Bumblebee Watch. All right, so walking you guys through Bumblebee Watch. So Bumblebee Watch is our online data submission platform. I'll mention, you might notice there is this word staging.bumblebeewatch.org. So this is actually our staging site. Some of the updates I'm going to be showing you aren't live on the Bumblebee Watch website quite yet, but we are going to be updating them before the field season. So this should be what it looks like for you before June 1st or after June 1st, after the field season starts. So first step when you go to Bumblebee Watch is to make sure that you're logged in. If you navigate to the right-hand side of the screen, there's a button that says your account. You're just going to click And then you can register if you haven't registered for Bumblebee Watch already, or you can sign in if you already have an account. So I'm just going to sign in with my username and password. Once I'm signed in, I can submit my survey data ready to go there. So if you navigate to the left-hand side of the screen, there'll be a button that says Add Bumblebee Sightings. You can click that, and that will bring up the project options. So there are a few different options here. The first one that you'll see is Bumblebee Watch. So this is the option that you'll pick if you are submitting an incidental sighting of a bumblebee. If you're walking back from your field site and you happen to see a really cool bee and you take a picture of it, not during your survey, you can submit it to Bumblebee Watch. Bumblebee Atlas is where we are going to be submitting our survey data for the Atlas. So this is where you'll submit your rapid habitat assessment data as well as all of your observations of bumblebees. There are two options here. Option one is the inventory option. So this is for surveys that are not long-term monitoring surveys. You can submit sightings there. But if you're submitting long-term monitoring surveys, you want to choose phase 2 long-term monitoring and hit that submit sightings button. All right, so once you've chosen your project, the next step is to select the location where you surveyed. And there are two options here. If you submitted to Bumblebee Watch in the past, you can choose from your historic locations. Each location has a name, and you can click on one of those if you're trying to submit data to a place where you've already submitted data. But if this is a new site for you, you're going to need to add a new location. So if you click Add a New Location, you can just input directly the latitude and longitude of that site and give it a name, or you can choose to select it on a map. So if you click Select on a map, you can choose a location where you've surveyed. If you've gone to a public property that is searchable, you can type in the name of that property and click, and that will bring it up. So basically just like Google Maps. And then once you have scrolled in enough where you can move, like you can actually see where the property is, you can hit satellite and explore the property in more detail if you need. All you need to do is drop a pin where you surveyed and then hit select set location, and that will input the latitude and longitude for you. Then you just need to give it a name that you can refer to later and then hit proceed. Okay, step 3 is entering your habitat data. So the first question is, how accurate is this location in meters? Basically how sure you are of that point you dropped. Are you very sure that that's the exact location that was the center of your survey area? Or can you not quite remember exactly where this survey area was specifically, but you're pretty sure it's within 250 meters? You're just going to choose the option that best fits how sure you are of that location. Next, you're going to enter the date of your survey. So if you did that survey on July 22nd, you'll input that there. The next question is survey type. So for long-term monitoring, you're always going to want to select point because we're doing point style surveys. For a collection method, you should choose the option that best fits what you did. Ideally, you'll be going out and trying to capture all of the bees that you observe in your hectare size site, but during the peak season in July and August, things can get really crazy. You might be seeing tons and tons of bees. So in that case, we recommend that you collect at least 10 of each bumblebee species that looks different. And then you can mark that you did a combination of capture all and captured all of the different species that you saw. The next question asks how many hectares was your survey area. This should always be 1 if you're doing a point style survey. The next input is the number of surveyors that went out and did the survey. So if you just went by yourself, you're just going to hit 1. If you went out with a friend and split up that survey time, then you would enter the number of people who helped you with your survey. The next thing to input is the start time and the end time of your survey. And so this is going to be when you started and then when you wrapped things up. The surveys are 45 person minutes, but sometimes it takes a lot longer when you're catching things and moving them into vials and then bringing it back to your cooler. A 45 person minute survey can take more than 45 minutes, so you want to input that end time when you wrapped things up. The next question asks what the survey length is in minutes. That's going to be 45 person minutes for your point surveys. The next set of questions asks some basic information about weather. What was the temperature? What's the cloud cover? What's the wind speed? You're just going to refer back to your data sheet and input what you had written down. There is a spot where you can input weather notes. So if it's really smoky out when you go and do your survey and you want to make note of that, that's where you can record information like smoke conditions or other things that don't come up within those first few questions. The next set of questions refers to what habitat is in your survey area and then the surrounding area. So the first question is, what is the best habitat type that describes the area that you did your hectare size survey? Were you in a grassland? Were you in an ag land? Were you in a riparian area? Just choose the one that best fits the area you surveyed. And then the next set of questions refers to the area that surrounds your hectare-sized site. So if you're in your hectare-sized site and you're looking around, what different types of land cover are you seeing? Are you seeing primarily ag lands? Are you seeing primarily forests? And then you can fill these in based on what you see. Now, if there's only one type of land cover that surrounds your hectare-sized area, that's totally fine. That happens sometimes. You just need to fill in this first one. If you see different types of land cover, you can also input the optional secondary habitat type and tertiary habitat type. It just depends on what you see. The next question asks what percentage of the plot you can actively search for bumblebees on flowers on. So, maybe that was 50%. Just input what best fits from the drop-down menu here. The next set of questions asks about what types of nesting resources are available in your hectare-sized site. So as you're walking through your survey area, you want to check, are you seeing things like brush piles and bunch grasses and leaf litter and bare soil, mulch, duff, rock piles, rodent holes, or tunnels? These are all different types of substrates that bumblebees use to nest in. And you're just going to click the things that you observed during your survey. The next few questions ask about different types of land management practices you're seeing evidence of in your hectare-sized site. So say you see some mown grass or areas that have been recently mown, you can input yes there. If you see any of the following evidence of different types of management for grazing, so if you're seeing hoof prints or cow pies or animals, you're just going to want to click those options. If you see any evidence of insecticide use or herbicide use, so things like patches of dead plants that look like they've been recently sprayed or tags that indicate insecticide use. If you're not 100% sure, but you think that those chemicals could be used, you can always put in suspect here instead of yes or no. And then evidence of fire. So, scorched earth or blackened plants or any sort of evidence of a recent fire, you can hit yes there. All right, so the next question asks how many honeybees you observed in 10 minutes. So that refers to that rapid honeybee assessment, 10-minute search for all of the honeybees you see in your survey plot. And then there is a place to input management notes if you want to take any other notes about the different types of land management that have been done at the area you've surveyed. So this next question, the number of flower species, this refers to the number of different flowering plants you observed in your survey area during your survey. So you just want to pick the number that you saw when you went and did your rapid habitat assessment. And that will bring up some new fields where you can input the species and the percentage for each flowering plant that you observed. This dropdown for each plant is hooked up to iNaturalist, so it will pull from the iNaturalist database when you start typing. So if I start typing in the common name for a species or the scientific name, it will bring up some options and I can choose the appropriate option from that drop-down menu. And then I can just input the percentage there on the side. Now, if you're not sure of the species of flower that you encountered, you just are able to identify it to genus, that's okay. Ideally, it's best to identify things to species, but if you can't do it, it's better to stick with what you know. So you can input the genus name and then just select the genus instead of the specific a more specific option that has a species name associated with it, and that will just put in the genus name. So this percentage, as a reminder, should add up to 100% because together it makes up the entire area of your hectare size survey site that's covered by flowers. If you are performing surveys as a volunteer, you are going to want to click "This survey was a volunteer effort," and that will bring up some new fields where you can input the amount of time that you spent volunteering and engaging with different types of Atlas training materials and how many miles you drove during your survey trip. And this information helps us keep track of the efforts of our volunteers. It's really, really helpful for us. There is a place on your data sheet where you can go and input this information. So when you started volunteering the day of your survey and when you stopped volunteering on the day of your survey, basically when you started planning and driving, how many miles you drove, and then how much time you spent organizing and entering your data. So you're going to want to do this for each survey that you do. There's also an option to indicate if you used online resources for training. So independent of this live webinar event, if you used our protocols handbook, if you read through that, or if you watched any of our training videos asynchronously, you can input that information here and it will help us keep track of how much time you guys are spending on the Atlas. For this, you only need to do this once. So if you've done multiple surveys, please make sure that you only enter that data one time so we don't double count it. All right, so the next option is to select, did you detect bees during your survey? If you detected no bees during your survey, you want to hit no here and then enter your rapid habitat assessment data. It's really important to fill out the survey information on Bumblebee Watch, even if you didn't see any bees, because that helps us keep track of the places where no bees were seen. If you did detect bees during your survey, you're going to want to hit yes here, and then you can type in your name to sign your survey, and then hit proceed. And that will bring you to the final step of data submission, which is uploading your sightings. So on this last step, if you go to add sighting, you can submit a Bumblebee sighting. If you hit select photos, it will allow you to navigate to the folder where your photos of each bumblebee are saved. So I've saved some photos on my desktop of a bee. I can just highlight all of these photos and hit open, and that will upload all of my photos of this bee to my survey or to my observation. So once I have uploaded all of the photos that I want to upload, the next step is to input what species I believe I saw. If you're not sure of the species, it's okay to put in species or unknown bumblebee. But if you do know what species you saw, you can input the species name. You can also, if you're not comfortable identifying bumblebees to species, use this AI identification tool. If you click it, it will bring up a suggested species based on the photos that you uploaded, and you can select that if you'd like to. This count field won't come up for you all. This just comes up because I'm an Atlas coordinator, so you can ignore that. Reference ID, this is an optional field that you can input if you want to link your sighting to something like an iNaturalist observation, or if you took a bunch of pictures of the floral host that your bee was on and want to link that to your sighting, that's where you can input it. The next field is the sex of the bee. So if you know that the bee is a queen or a worker or a male or a female, that's where you can input that. If you're not sure, you can hit not determined. Floral host, if your bee was caught on a flower, you can input the flower it was caught on here. Just like the rapid habitat assessment fields, if you type in the name of the flower, it will pop up. Sometimes you do have to type in almost the entire word for it to pop up, but it will pop up eventually. And so you can input that there. You can take any notes about the floral host that you would like to. And then lastly, we have this observation notes field, which is a good place to input if you saw the bee on something other than a flower, if you saw it perching or mating or something like that. Or if you are keeping track of the time at which you encounter the target species during your survey, you can input that here. The last field asks whether or not you want to mark this observation as private. If you click that, this will make the location and sighting information of that bee observation inaccessible to public view on Bumblebee Watch, and will make that sighting private. Please note that this is only for the sighting itself. It's not for the survey location. It's just for the sighting. But you can click that if you'd like to keep that sighting private. And from there, you can hit Save Sighting. And then once it's saved, you have an observation of a bumblebee associated with your checklist. Now, if you have more bumblebees that you want to log, you can hit Add Sighting again, and then fill out all of the fields again. There's also an option to add nest. So if you encountered a bumblebee nest during your survey, you can also input that here. But once you're done inputting all of your sightings, you can just click out of this window. You're all done. Your surveys have been submitted. And if you want to look at your checklist again and make sure that everything has been properly entered, you can actually go to your account, my profile, and that will bring up a list of all of your checklists. So this is the checklist that I just logged. I can click on it, and it will bring up that checklist information. And so from there, I can edit it if I need to, or add more sightings if I need to. And that wraps up the section on habitat or data entry. And I'm just going to X out and stop my screen share.
Do you want to answer a few questions before we move on to ID, since there's quite a few here that are related directly to surveying?
Yes, I think that that's a good idea.
Okay.
And I'll also give folks a little bit of a chance to take a break if they need to use the restroom or something like that. So I think we can spend the next 5 minutes or so answering questions. And then Katie, we can move to the ID and photo tips section after that.
That's good.
Okay. I'm just gonna bring up the Q&A. Okay, Katie, it says that you would like to answer the can we adopt multiple grids?
Yeah, so some of these I just saved because they either came up multiple times or I thought they would be good to answer live.
Yeah. Okay. So can we adopt multiple grids? Yes. You may adopt as many grids as you are able to do surveys for. Um, yeah, you are highly encouraged to adopt multiple grids if you would like to. So the next question is percent of total plants calculated as a ratio against all plants or just all flowering plants? So I would calculate that for just the plants that are in flower. We don't want to worry about things that are not actively in bloom because those are not resources that are available for the bees at that time. We just want to focus on the blooming plants for our assessments of floral availability. The next question is, what if you are not very good at identifying flowers and plants? Are iNaturalist IDs accurate enough? Yeah, you may use apps like iNaturalist and Seek to help you identify plants. I personally don't find them accurate for species identifications all the time. I recommend them for identifying things down to genus, and then you can just input that genus information in your data sheet. And when you go to upload your data to Bumblebee Watch, you just want to input the genus of that plant in your form. But yeah, I use iNaturalist and Seek sometimes to help me with my plant IDs, and it's a great tool, and I highly recommend using it. All right, the next question is, if we are surveying the same site repeatedly, June through September, do we use the new long-term monitoring protocol for any surveys we do in July and August, and the phase 1 protocol for those done in June and September? Or if it's all the same site all season, do we just use the long-term monitoring program whenever we survey there? So that's a great question. If you are surveying a location outside of a long-term monitoring site, or if you're doing surveys in June and September, you can still use the new long-term monitoring protocol. It's not going to take away anything. We're just adding a few extra things. So you are welcome to use that long-term monitoring protocol wherever you're surveying, if you're doing surveys in June or September. I will filter out the data when I analyze it to just focus on the surveys in our long-term monitoring stations at the right survey period. But you can still use those protocols. And it is nice because that if you do use the long-term monitoring survey protocols, it gives us the option to use that data in the future. So if we want to include data that's collected outside of those long-term monitoring stations in an analysis, we still have that data there. So yeah, you're welcome to use that new long-term monitoring protocol at other places. And then the last question in the queue, if the queen bumblebee dies, can workers raise a new queen? So for bumblebees, the queen bumblebee, if she dies, then a new queen probably can't. The colony can produce other new queens, but those queens won't be mated with the correct timing. And so if the queen dies, basically that colony is going to wrap up really soon. And will expire for this season.
Expire. That's a kind way to put that.
Senesce is also a nice one.
Yes, that's a nice one too. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. How does that look to everybody?
Looks great.
Cool. So we are now going to move into identifying and how to photograph bumblebees. And photographing is a huge, huge part of this project, but we save it for the end because it's kind of challenging to talk about photographing bumblebees without showing you how to identify them, right? Because when we take photos, we want you to take them in such a way that experts are able to identify them from the photographs. So we're going to talk about identifying bumblebees first, so you sort of know what features we're looking for in the photographs to make it a little bit easier to learn how to photograph your bees. So the first part is bumblebee ID. We're going to go through how to tell bumblebees apart from other insects that you might see out in the field, because the first time you go out to do your own survey, your eyes are going to look for anything that's flying. So you might want to catch a fly, you might want to catch a wasp, you might want to catch another bee. So we're going to sort of give your brain some cues on how to narrow down to just looking for bumblebees. So the first step here is to figure out if you have a bee or not. There are many, many types of flies that mimic bumblebees. So on this slide here, if you've been to this training before, maybe you can recognize where the bee is, but take a second here to just take a guess at which picture is of a bumblebee. There's only one. And if you guessed this one, you're correct. But you can also see that there's quite a bit of mimicry going on with flies. And so some of the ways that we can differentiate bumblebees from flies are by the things on the screen here. So the first one is the number of wings. Bees are all going to have 4 wings, although when they're in flight, their wings are going to be joined, so it looks like 2. But when you're handling them after they've been chilled, you'll see that they have 4 wings, and flies are only going to have 2. Bees are also going to be carrying very large pollen loads, if they're females, that is, on their hind legs. And flies don't have that same capability, right? So they might have some pollen grains scattered on their bodies, but they're not going to be purposefully placed on their hind legs. Bumblebees are always going to be pretty hairy to our naked eyes, and flies, well, they do have some hairs, and some of the robber flies can be very hairy. Most of them that we're going to see aren't going to have hairs. Bees also have long elbowed antennae, and flies usually have short stubby antennae, which you can see both of those in these images here. And then the other thing to look for is the eyes. And I don't have a good picture of a bee on this slide for this, but bees usually have their eyes on the side of their head, and they're not going to touch in the center. Whereas if you look at that fly picture, you can see it has the stereotypical insect eyes, right? They're really big, they're really bulgy, they're touching in the center of the head. So those are just a few ways to tell bumblebees from flies. Wasps are another one. We don't get too many pictures of people submitting wasps because they're pretty easy to tell apart once you know how to look for a bumblebee, right? Wasps have a very signature look to them. They're often brightly colored. They have more of a fierce look to them. They're pretty tough looking. They have narrower bodies. Many of them have tiny thread waists that we call them that you can actually visually see. So bumblebees will have that same pinched waist, but it's harder for us to see it with the naked eye. Wasps are not going to be carrying pollen like the bumblebees do. Again, they might have some pollen grains on them, but they won't be carrying those big pollen sacs on their hind legs. So once we've figured out we definitely have a bee, right? We don't have a wasp, we don't have a fly. The next step is to figure out if we have a bumblebee or some other kind of bee in the area. If you do have a different fly or wasp, you can go to bugguide.net and submit your pictures, or by naturalists. There's a lot of great people that can help you figure out what you have if you're interested in that. So the first bee to keep an eye out for are honeybees. These ones are a little bit more orange in color than most of the bumblebees are. They have a very torpedo-shaped abdomen, so different shape than the bumblebees. They will carry pollen on the same part of the hind leg that bumblebees do, because honeybees and bumblebees are pretty closely related. And if your camera is advanced enough when you're photographing bees and you see hairy eyes, that's a good sign that you have a honeybee there. Carpenter bees are ones that many people often confuse with bumblebees when they're first starting out. If you look at the abdomen, so the top 2 pictures of these bees here, you can see that they're quite different. One of them, the bumblebee, is pretty hairy, whereas the carpenter bee is pretty shiny, right? Most of the abdomen isn't covered in hair. And then those bottom 2 pictures, we're looking at the hind leg of the bee, so where they're collecting pollen. Bumblebees have what we call a corbicula or the pollen basket, which is like a hairless triangular zone on their hind leg, whereas carpenter bees are going to have scopy, where those are more like a bottle brush, if you think of it. There's a lot of dense, tiny hairs there. And these features are not super easy to train your brain into, but once you start looking at bumblebees up close, you'll start to notice some of these features. So don't be intimidated by this. If you end up submitting a picture of a carpenter bee, it's totally okay, and we will mark it as such.
Hey, Katie, wanted to jump in to say you might want to turn your video off.
Oh,
Or like sorry, it's
you're
just
not
there are
working?
some parts that have been a little laggy.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Okay, how's that?
Looks good.
Well, I guess we'll see. Okay, thanks for the heads up, Jenny. Okay, so the next bee is a digger bee or a longhorn bee. These also get confused with bumblebees quite frequently. And these ones are harder to tell, especially as you're first learning. So again, it's okay if you submit a picture of one of these, we'll mark it appropriately. One of the things you can look for is that many of the digger or longhorn bees will have this protuberance on their face, kind of a nose, if you think of it that way. There's just a bump on their face, where bumblebees have more of a flat face. And then same thing with the hind leg. They're going to have the bottle brush hairs, those scopal hairs, so lots of dense, tiny hairs on their hind leg, compared to the bumblebee that has the hairless triangular zone there. My screen seems to be lagging on my end now. There we go. Okay, so now that we know we've got a bumblebee, we're going to move on to male versus female bumblebees. So this is not something, again, that you have to do, but if you want to try and sex your bees, you're more than welcome to do that. To tell males and females apart, one of the main things you can do is, again, look at that hind leg. So the hind leg of a female bee is going to have that corbicula or the pollen basket, right? The hairless zone on their hind leg. And males, because they're not collecting pollen, they don't have the structure. So their hind leg is going to have hairs all over it. Next is the abdominal segments. So females, the abdomen is split into 6 different sections, and males have an extra abdominal segment. And I'm not asking you to go out and count the abdominal segments on a bee, but if you catch a bumblebee that looks a little bit longer and narrower, it's a good sign that it might be a male. Same with antennae. The male bees have 1 extra antennal segment, and in some of the species, those antennal segments are actually elongated in the males. So the antennae look longer on a male. And this is really, really hard to tell in the field, especially if you're new, even if you're experienced, unless you have the 2 species side by side, it can be hard to see the difference in antennal length. Stingers, so only female bees are going to have stingers. So if you're taking photos and you see a stinger, you know that you have a female right away. So the stinger is a modified ovipositor or an egg-laying device. So the males do not have those. And in some of the species, like the brown-belted bumblebee or the Nevada bumblebee, the males are going to have enlarged eyes. So if you look at the 2 photos there, the female is on the left and the male is on the right. You can see the male has a little bit more bulbous eyes, right? The eyes are taking up a lot of the space on the head. So this isn't going to be the males of every species, but in some of them, like the Southern Plains, for example, they have very large eyes on the male. And then just overall appearance. Again, this is a very hard feature to look at in the field if you're new. Males tend to have a lot more yellow hairs, a lot more longer hairs, just sort of all over their body. So they have more of a shaggier appearance to them compared to the females that look a little bit more well-groomed. Again, much easier to tell if you have the 2 male and female side by side. So if you want to give it a go at sexing your bee, you certainly can, but don't let it overwhelm you at the same time. And then the next part, once you decide you have a female bee, we're going to look at if you have a cuckoo or a true bumblebee. And these photos are pretty hard to look at. They're actually terrible to look at, from my opinion here. The photo on the left is the hind leg of a cuckoo bumblebee, and you can see that she does not have a pollen basket or a corbicula, whereas the photo on the right is of a corbicula, so that kind of shiny area that you can make out is the pollen basket. Female cuckoo bumblebees are not collecting pollen, so they don't have a pollen basket. I think we can show this in some of the upcoming photos as well. Cuckoo bumblebees also have pretty sparse hairs on the abdomen. So if you look at the true bumblebee on the right, you can see her abdomen is really full. There's a lot of dense hairs there. You can't really see the exoskeleton or the skin of the bee. Whereas the cuckoo bumblebee, you can see right through those hairs, right? You can see the actual body of the bee. Cuckoo bumblebees also have more of a tapered abdomen than the female true bumblebees, if you will. And this is because they're more so built for armor, right? They need a stronger body because their role is to go in and usurp the nest of the existing queen. So they either need to harm her or kill her in order to take over her nest. And so the way that their body is built is a little bit more armored, as we like to describe it, than the true bumblebee. So that extra curve in the abdomen helps her get those tasks done. Here's another photo you can see. It's just got a little bit more curve there to the abdomen. And then same with the head. The head of a cuckoo bumblebee is much thicker than the head of a regular bumblebee. Okay, so now once we know we have a cuckoo or a true bumblebee, we're going to move on to the identification sheets that we've made for these projects. So these are just single pieces of paper that you can bring into the field with you to help identify. And for Missouri, the way that this sheet is split up is any bee on the left side means the first abdominal segment of that bee is yellow. And on the right side, the first abdominal segment is black. So depending on which bee you have in front of you, you can sort of start by narrowing down from that feature. In Nebraska, there's quite a few more species of bumblebees, so we've split it into 3 different segments. The first section is bees with yellow on the first abdominal segment. The middle section there is if the bee has orange in it, and the third section is if the first abdominal segment is black. And then on the back side of both of these data sheets, there's all of these steps here to remind you how to identify the bumblebee and then what types of things you'll need to capture in your photographs, right? The front of the face, the top of the head, different pieces of the thorax, different pieces of the abdomen. And we're going to go through all of this, but just so you know, all of this is on the back of the data, the ID guide, excuse me. Okay, so bumblebee anatomy. These are the 3 parts that we're going to use to identify the bees and the 3 parts that we're going to ask you to photograph. So bees are split into 3 parts, just like any other insect, where you have the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. And the abdomen is split into 6 different sections there, which is what you see tergites. Tergite 1 abbreviated to T1 and tergite 6 abbreviated to T6. And so when we look at the thorax, we're going to split that further into 3 different sections, right? We're going to look at both the color of the hair that we see in each of those sections, as well as the patterns that we see. And let me get my laser pointer out here. Okay. So the sections on the abdomen can be challenging to see at first, for sure. So we have these numbers on here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of each of the segments. And where you sort of see this yellow line end is the end of segment 1. And we have the end of segment 2, the end of segment 3. So wherever you kind of see a line on the bee's body is the different sections. And this gets easier as you practice. It's definitely not easy to train your eyes on it at first. So we're going to go through the big three that we like to call them. So the most common species that you're going to find in Missouri and Nebraska, and then we'll go over the species of greatest conservation need. So those target species that we're looking for. And in each one of these slides, we're going to have the features that you're looking at on the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. And we'll have a map of the Bumblebee Watch and Bumblebee Atlas data. So anywhere where there's a point on the map is where somebody has conducted a survey and found this species. And those X's are where people have found this species and submitted it incidentally. So here we're looking at the common eastern bumblebee, or Bombus impatiens. We can see the front of the head is black and the top of the head is yellow. So we're talking about this section right here. The front is black and the top is yellow. The thorax is yellow with a black circle or a teardrop in the center. So that would be this section of the body here. We've got a yellow thorax, and there's some mixing of black hairs in here, which gives it more of a teardrop shape. And then the abdomen, the first segment is yellow, and then the rest are black. Very common bee. This one is commercially reared, so people can purchase it and use it for research and in their agricultural practices. So this one you're going to find all over the place. Next is the two-spotted bumblebee, or Bombus bimaculatus. The hairs on the front of the head of this bee are black, and the hairs on the top of the head are yellow. The thorax is yellow with a black circle in the center, which you can see in here, the yellow thorax with a black circle in the center. And then the abdomen, the first segment is yellow. The second segment has a yellow W on it, so this right here. And this is a really beautiful picture of this bee. Sometimes this W is very hard to see. Sometimes it's only a little splotch of yellow. So just know that there can be variation within the species, and we're going to show you some pretty nice pictures to learn from. Next is the brown-belted bumblebee, or Bombus griseoculus. The hairs on the front of the face are black, and the top of the head are also black. The thorax is mostly yellow, again with a black circle in the center, so you can see that here. And these black circles are made up of black hairs. T1 is yellow. T2 is where it gets its name from, so it usually has a brown or sometimes a yellow crescent or a half moon. So if you look right here, you can see there's a line of brown hairs. I've also heard some people call this a fanny pack. So you can think of it as the bee wearing a brown fanny pack, which is really adorable to me. The next one, this is our first target species here. This is the Southern Plains bumblebee, or Bombus fraternus. The hairs on the top of the head of this bee are black, and the front of the face are black. It's yellow on the thorax with a very nice, wide, obvious black band between the wings. There's not usually variation in this part of the bee here, right? It usually always has this nice band between the wings. The abdomen, the first two segments, so right here we've got 1 and 2, are yellow, and the rest are black. And the special thing about the abdominal hairs here is that they're oppressed on the abdomen, so it almost looks like somebody took some grease or some gel and combed through them. So when you look at this bee up close, you'll actually notice that the hairs, instead of sticking straight up like all the other bumblebees, they're actually laying flat on the abdomen. Next is the American bumblebee, or Bombus pennsylvanicus. So the hairs on this bee's face are black. The thorax has yellow in front of the wings, black in the middle of the wings, and then behind the wings here, it can either be black, or it can be yellow, or it can be a mix of black and yellow. Oftentimes we see the mix of black and yellow in our area. The abdomen, the key feature here is that the first segment, so right in this area, is half black and half yellow. Again, this can vary, but most times when we see this, it's half black and half yellow. Black and gold bumblebee, or Bombus oricomis. This one looks very similar to the American bumblebee. One of the key ways to tell it apart is that the hairs on the top of the head are yellow. So if you look right here, this little stripe of yellow, you can think of that as a gold crown, right? It has yellow hairs on top of its head. A Missouri volunteer actually coined this as the bumblebee eyebrows when we first launched this project. So that's a fun way to think of it too. This bee also has yellow in front of the wings, a black stripe behind the wings, and then again, this bee can have yellow or black behind the wings on the thorax. The abdomen, T1 is usually mostly black, but there can be some patches of yellow. So you can see this bee has a little bit of yellow there on T1. T2 and 3, so those second and third abdominal segments are yellow, and then the remainders are black. And just to show these two species side by side here, we have the yellow hairs, the yellow eyebrows, gold crown, however your brain wants to think of it, on the black and gold bumblebee. And then on the American bumblebee, you can see it has black hairs up here. And then again with the abdomen, the American bumblebee has the half black, half yellow on T1. And black and gold is usually black, but you can see on this bee here, there are some little yellow tufts on the sides. So making sure that you can take clear photos of the abdomen without those first couple of segments being obscured is pretty important for us to tell these two species apart. The yellow bumblebee, or Bombus fervidus, is our next target species. This one is very, very beautiful, pretty infrequent in both states. The hair on the head for this bee is going to be all black. You can see that nicely in this photo here. We've got black hairs on the top of the head, black hairs on the front of the face. The thorax is going to be all yellow with a pretty narrow black band between the wings. And then T1 through T5 are going to be yellow on this bee. So this bee is very, very yellow if you see it out in the field, which hopefully you will. We want to find a few more observations of this bee. And then we have the half black bumblebee, or Bombus vagans. Again, a pretty infrequent bee that's detected in the atlas. The hair on the top of this bee's head is going to be yellow, which again, you can see that in this photo here. It's got a little yellow tuft right in here. The thorax is yellow with a black circle in the center. Those first two abdominal segments are yellow and the rest are black. So description-wise, this one matches the Southern Plains bumblebee that we talked about earlier, but one of the ways to tell those apart is by the hair color on the top of the head. So taking a nice picture of the face is going to be really key for us to identify different species. And then we have the Morrison bumblebee, or Bombus morrisoni. This is going to be our last target species. This one is very, very infrequently observed. I think we have one observation of it from a Nebraska survey, and the rest I think have been incidental, besides that one in South Dakota there. So this bee is pretty unique. The thorax is all yellow. There's no black hair on it. You can see there's a nice photo of it here. There's no band in it, no circle. It's just all yellow. The hairs on the top of the head are usually yellow. Sometimes there's only a few yellow hairs in there. And then T1 through T3 are all yellow and the rest are black. And this bee is usually found in drier areas. So if you're out in western Nebraska, definitely keep your eyes peeled for that. And then lastly, just to show some of the cuckoo bees, the lemon cuckoo bumblebee, or Bombus citrinus. This first one here has been observed a few times in Nebraska, maybe once in Missouri. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Don't fact check me there. We'll look on the map later. That one can be found. Pretty unique bee. It's got an all yellow thorax. Here, there's no stripe, no dot in the middle of it, just pure yellow. The indiscriminate cuckoo bumblebee has been found in Western Nebraska on a survey. This one has a huge yellow tuft of hair on the head. Pretty obvious bee as well when we're looking to identify it because it's mostly black and then it just has some yellow tufts towards the end of its abdomen on the side. And then suckling cuckoo bumblebee and variable cuckoo bumblebee. Neither of those species have been seen anywhere in the US since about 1999 to 2001. So you can keep your eyes peeled for them. If you find them, you'll make history. But definitely, if you think you have one of these, I would run through your identification cues again and just double check. And again, everything that you submit to Bumblebee Watch, we'll double check as well and take a look at. So now we're going to move on to, where's my pointer? There we go. Okay. Turn off the laser pointer. Now we're going to move into photographs. So now that we've talked about identification and you sort of have an idea of what things we're looking at when trying to differentiate different species, making sure you can photograph those features is going to be really important. So the first angle is a good picture of the face or the head. We need to be able to see those hair colors on the front of the face and the top of the head. Some of us are going to be checking for cheek length or the malar space. So this is definitely not something you have to pay attention to, but right in here beneath the eye and where the bee's mandible is, where their jaw starts, some bumblebees have long cheeks and some bumblebees have short cheeks. And that is a very good feature for us to look at to narrow down which species we're considering. So that's not something you have to dive into, but just know a good picture of the face can really be valuable there. And antennal segments, another one. So when we talked about males having longer antennae than females, sometimes if we really can't tell, someone might try and count the antennal segments from a photo. We usually don't have to resort to that level, but if you can photograph the antennae in there, it can be helpful for us to see. The next angle is of the side profile. So this one is important for both sexing and more species ID, right? This allows us to see the hind leg so we can assess if it's a male, if it's a female, if it's a cuckoo bee, all by looking at that hind leg. And it also allows us to see the abdomen and the thorax and sometimes even the side of the face to really get a view of those hair colors and the different patterns that we're seeing. And then lastly is one of a top-down or a dorsal view. So this is where you really want to make sure that the wings are spread. Oftentimes when you catch and chill bumblebees, their wings will be resting over their abdomen, so you can't really see all of the features, kind of like this, right? You can't see what the pattern is on T1 and T2 there. So you want to make sure you can open up those wings, and their wings are pliable so you can touch them. They're not made out of scales like butterflies. You can move them around. Some people don't like to touch the wings, so they'll use the tip of a pen or a pencil. I've seen people go out with toothpicks and like dental tools so that they have something with a finer tip. You're welcome to do that. Your fingertips work just fine though if you don't want to use anything else. And getting the top-down view helps us to see all the abdominal segments on there. A few tips when you're taking photographs. Before you take your first bee out of the cooler, make sure to test your focal length and your lighting of whatever camera you're using with something tiny, right? This could be the tip of a flower, it could be the tip of your pencil, just something to make sure that your light is good and that your camera is focusing on the proper place. A lot of times when you use a macro lens or a macro setting on your camera, it's going to try and pick up the very tip of the wing that's closest to you. And it would be a shame to get home and see that all of your photos are out of focus because your camera did that. So make sure to test your focal length before you take your bee pictures. And same thing with lighting, right? You want to either take your test photos in the shade, and if that works, great. If it doesn't, try moving into the sun, because if photos are too light or overexposed, it can be hard for us to assess the bee because some of the patterns or the hair colors can be misconstrued, right? Some of them might look orange or yellow when maybe they're black, but a flash hit them or something weird. So make sure to check that your photos are coming out okay. Oftentimes, when getting a good photo of the bee's face, it can help to put the bee on their back. This way, it kind of tilts their head up. So you can see the photo on the right there. I can see the hair color on the top of the head, in the front of the face. I can see the antennae. I can see the cheek length versus the one on the left where the bee has her chin tucked, if you will. So sometimes just flipping the bee over allows you to get a much better photo of the face. And then vials. Please do not take your photos of bees in the vials. You can see through these images here that it's very, very hard to see what is inside there. Like, yes, we can tell that's a bumblebee, but getting it down to a particular species and the sex is very hard to do when they're in the vial. So please do chill your bees and take your photos of them once they're immobile. These pictures we want to avoid at all costs in the field. So before you put your bees in the ice chest, make sure that your vial is fully closed, right? Sometimes the caps can go on a little cattywampus. You want to make sure your cap is on correctly. It's sealed nice and tight. You don't need to submerge it all the way in the water. You just need to put the plastic part, not the actual cap, in the ice. And then check on your vials throughout the season. As the vials are exposed to heat and then ice and then heat and then ice, they can crack. And if they crack, water can start to get into them. And then we end up with wet bees. And that can be fatal to bees. It isn't always, but it can be. So we just want to avoid having this done to the bees. In the case that you do end up with wet bees, you can very carefully take the edge of your shirt or your pants and just try to dab off some of the water, place the bee in a safe spot and allow it to warm up, dry off, groom itself, and hopefully it will fly away. And then we have a grid scale form. So on the back of the second data sheet that Jenny showed earlier, where the overflow section is, we have a scale on the back of that. It's helpful for us if you can take at least one photo of each of the bees you capture on this scale sheet or next to a ruler so that we have some sort of scale and size estimate when we're identifying your bees. Okay, and then I'll pass it back to Jenny. Do you want to share? Do you want me to keep clicking through these?
I can share this section. So that wraps up the ID and photo tips section of our presentation. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to give you guys a couple quick little updates of some things that are going to be changing. A lot of changes this year in general. But we are also going to be making some updates to our landing page on the website. Missouri and Nebraska have separate landing pages for volunteers to go find resources and links to data sheets and all that good stuff. We're going to be moving to a combined landing page for the Midwest Long-Term Monitoring Project. So keep an eye out for that. We'll have that up before the June 1st start date of the field season. And then we're also going to be moving to a combined e-newsletter because, this is a regional project now. We're doing this long-term monitoring effort in Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, and Minnesota within the next few years. And so we want to build that regional coalition of volunteers. And a lot of things that are relevant to folks in Iowa and Missouri and Nebraska are going to be relevant to everybody. And it'll also probably help you guys keep track of what upcoming events are going to be in your area. Omaha, like so many of the big cities in the region are just on those state borders. And, we want you guys to know about those exciting opportunities. So just a couple quick changes that are going to be happening this year. And Katie, you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So to wrap things up, We are going to be sending out an email to you all within the next week or so once the recording is up on YouTube with a link to that recording, as well as a list of relevant links that we discussed during this training. I'm sorry to hear that the chat is disabled and so we weren't able to drop those links live for you, but if you keep an eye out for that follow-up email, everything that we discussed, the grid adoption page, the link to Bumblebee Watch, links to other resources, links to our data sheets, those will all be in that follow-up email. So please keep an eye out for that. You can, if you have any questions, shoot us an email at bumblebeeatlas@xerces.org, and we'd be happy to answer those for you. Yeah, and as we wrap up, just a shout out to our supporters. The Bumblebee Atlas would not be possible without the support of so many organizations and institutions. So thank you so much for that support. And then for those of you who are not always already members of the Xerces Society, you are welcome to join. This link here will take you to our website. The work that we do depends on the support of so many people, so you can help us out and make a difference for invertebrates that you love by becoming a member of our organization. And that wraps up our slide deck. I think we can move on to questions at this point, and I saw that there were a few questions that I marked answer live. And there's also a question that I responded to that I would like to answer live as well, about the process of adopting a grid cell. So one attendee asked, how long does it take to process adopting a grid cell? Is there a specific length of time we should register them before starting our survey effort? And you are welcome to adopt a grid as soon as you are ready to. You can adopt a grid now if you would like, or you can adopt a grid at any time during the field season. So, if you are thinking, I have an extra weekend off, I can go out and do some surveys, you can adopt the grid cell right then, and then go out and do those surveys, as long as you have the appropriate permissions and permits for your field site. Right. The next question that we have in the queue, when submitting sightings, when would you select worker versus female? So we have different castes in that drop down: male, female, worker, queen. Female can refer to either workers or queens, and sometimes it's really hard to tell the difference because we're mostly going off of the body size of the bee. I think I personally find it much easier to identify the cast of the bee from field observations than from photos. It's really hard for me to size the bee from a picture. Sometimes it's just if somebody puts their camera really close, the bee looks big. It doesn't matter how big it is in real life, it just looks big on my computer screen. So I will often mark bees as female almost all the time unless I can be really certain it's small and it's a worker. But females can refer to workers or queens. If you're sure you found a worker or if you're sure you found a queen, you're welcome to use either of those drop downs. And if you're not sure, you can just put in female or not determined. We got another question about reusable ice packs. Is it okay to use enclosed reusable ice packs to avoid the water issue? Generally, for chilling down bees, it's best to use ice that will surround the vial that you're putting in the cooler. If you're putting them against an ice pack, it's not going to surround the bee, and so it will take longer for the air temperature in that vial to cool down enough to chill the bee. So that can be a little bit more stressful for the bee to be in the cooler for longer. And then the other thing that I'll mention is that those reusable ice packs, sometimes they're made out of water and sometimes they're made out of chemicals that can be colder than water, like the water temperature of ice. So if you're using something that's too cold, it can chill the bee to the point where it does tissue damage. So you shouldn't use things like dry ice or blue ice because that would make the bee too cold and then they would suffer for that. So we want to make sure to just use regular water, ice, and using the ice packs is okay if you're using a water ice pack, but I don't recommend it because you just won't get your bees very cold very fast. And I don't think that we have any other open questions. We have a couple more minutes, so if you guys have a question, those of you in the audience, feel free to type it out now, and we can hang out until the end of the hour to answer any questions that you might have. It looks like we have another question pop up. Do you have an easy way to measure the area of the space to survey to see if it's a full hectare? So you can kind of eyeball it. It's okay if it's not 100% perfect. I usually envision, I used to run track in high school, and so I imagine two of those inside. I just imagine the track twice, pretty much, and then sort of eyeball it as I walk around. Um, or if you're familiar with football, 2 football fields is about a hectare sized area. Um, if you are tech savvy, you can use Google Earth to actually measure out a hectare. Um, so if you know exactly where you'll be surveying, you can go to Google Earth and then draw a big polygon of the area you think you'll be in. And then you can also use that to sort of eyeball what a hectare looks like. But I only recommend that if you are good with Google Earth and you're good with tech, it's okay to just sort of eyeball it and guesstimate. If you know how big the lot, if you have a yard, if you know how big the lot is, that can be a good way. Just like get a sense of how big your lot is and how many times you need to walk through your yard to do a hectare size survey.
And for that too, like when I'm estimating out in the field, I will try and give myself boundaries because sometimes once I start surveying, I just begin walking from flower patch to flower patch to flower patch. And before I know it, I'm outside of the bounds. So sometimes it can be helpful to be like, okay, I'm going to go to that tree at the far end, but not beyond it.
It looks like we have another question. Can we adopt grids in multiple states? Yes, you are welcome to adopt grids in multiple states. Wherever you think that you'll be able to do a survey, you are welcome to adopt that grid. We got a question about the grid adoption form. This person is having a little bit of trouble selecting the state or the grid. And this one I don't think I can answer live, but just to reiterate, if you're having any problems with the grid adoption form or you're having trouble signing up, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to talk to you on the phone to walk you through or troubleshoot any issues you might be having. I'll also mention too, this grid adoption form is new. So if you are having troubles with it, please let us know. We want to hear from you if you're running into hurdles or errors so we can fix them as soon as we can. One more question, is the Atlas active in Canada? So the Bumblebee Atlas is in 21 states in the United States. There's not a Bumblebee Atlas program associated with Xerces in Canada. However, folks who are in Canada can submit to Bumblebee Watch. So if you have incidental bumblebee sightings that you would like to share with researchers, you can still submit to Bumblebee Watch and share those via the Watch platform. Another question, will you send your email to participants? So in that follow-up email, there will be a link to contact us. So if you use that link, nebraskabumblebeeatlas.org or missouribumblebeeatlas.org, those emails go to both Katie and I. So if you're using one of those general emails, I will see it and I'll be able to respond to you. Or you can contact me directly. If you go to our contacts page on the Bumblebee Atlas, my contact information is linked there. My name is Genevieve Pajesic, and you can find me directly. Oh, we have a great question here. The grid I selected appears to be split between Missouri and Iowa. Is this correct, or is the state line off? If it's correct, can I survey on the Iowa side of the line? So for our new grid map, we did not clip it to the state boundaries. Some of the grids for the North American Bat Monitoring Project straddle a state boundary because it's a grid map that covers the entire region. For bats, they're not going to worry about state boundaries. Bees also don't worry about state boundaries, but for projects and programs and funders, state boundaries do matter a little bit. So I would say for this year, because Iowa is not starting long-term monitoring yet, I would try to stick to the Missouri side if you can, just so that we can count that as a Missouri survey. But in the following year, once we move to long-term monitoring in Iowa, you'd be welcome to survey on either side of that boundary. I'll also mention I'll be hanging out and staying on until we've answered all of the questions in the queue. But if you need to hop off now, we are at time. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us today. It's always such a joy to spend some time with you. I'm so excited to see some of you at our in-person trainings. And just thank you so much for your support and your time. This project truly would not be possible without you. And I'll also, before we move on to the next few questions in the queue, I'll give the other co-hosts an opportunity to say thanks and goodbye as well, for those of you who need to hop off now.
I can stay on until the end, but thanks for everybody that joined. If you need to jump off, great to see you today. Well, see you.
Same here.
Yep, thank you. Thank you for everybody spending their Sunday learning about bees. We appreciate the help.
Thanks for stopping in, everybody.
Right, I think we can answer these next couple of questions. Has anything changed as far as nest reporting? So for nest reporting, if you click on add a nest when you are in Bumblebee Watch, that will bring up a set of questions. Those questions will be updated this year, so keep an eye out for that. If you do expect to encounter a nest, I would check out those questions before you go out to the field, just so that you have an idea of what you want to record before you need to log it. There are some questions about nest traffic and the position of the nest and what the substrate it is in. So those things are great to record if you're able to. We'll be making those updates pretty soon, I think. And next question, if we are wearing clothing treated with permethrin for tick repellent, should we be concerned with incidental contamination of bees through handling them? I would not be concerned about incidental contamination from any chemicals that have been applied to your clothing, as long as you're not like rubbing the bee on your clothing, which you should not be. I also, just to emphasize, your safety is first and foremost, and there are a lot of tick-borne diseases in the Midwest, so I do recommend using our tick repellent or treating your clothing with permethrin. The main thing that I would be worried about is getting any repellent on my hands and not washing them and then touching any bees with my hands. So that I would not recommend, but applying any insecticide that you need to your clothing is something that you should do to be safe in the field. A question, how did you come up with the idea to involve people who are interested in bees and can take the time to do this? How successful was the first part? Yeah, so that is a great question. So I did not come up with this idea at all, first off. The first Bumblebee Atlas that was initiated in the US, I think, was in Minnesota by Elaine Evans in 2015 or 2016, and then in the Pacific Northwest in 2017. So those projects were established by Elaine Evans and Rich Hatfield and partners and have really grown and expanded to encompass many more states since then. So we've added Atlas programs in different states to our umbrella of programs through time, just because people are so excited about pollinators, because there's a real need for this data, and because the protocols that were established by Rich in the Pacific Northwest turned out to be really doable and powerful and easy to implement for lots of different people. And since those programs were started, I don't know, almost 10 years ago now, there has been a lot of interest in monitoring these bees over really large areas. And so this sorry guys, my son just came up to me and is holding my leg. I hope that you can't hear him. Um, so it was a very successful program. For context, in Nebraska and Missouri, I mentioned that big 50 by 50 kilometer grid map. We've surveyed every single one of those grids since those programs were first started in 2019 and 2020, respectively. So we're in a really good place to start moving into long-term monitoring in both of those states. Hundreds and hundreds of surveys, collecting thousands and thousands of bees across the region. All right, and with that, I think we can stop the recording.